Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
I was first introduced to the idea of political poetry on October 18, 1970, about midnight, in an all-night Harvard Square corner bookstore, Doug Rawlings writes. A few months before that encounter, I'd returned from the war in Vietnam. To say that I was confused and angry is an understatement. I was also somewhat lost. Then, on that fateful night, I found this wonderful collection of poems by Denise Levertov that captured her journey to North Vietnam as a peace activist. This was the first serious discussion I had read from and about my war. And true to what Robert Bly considers effective political poetry, Levertov used the personal to open up the universal. I was captured, and unlike my response to military service, I did not want to escape. Instead, I sought out more of her work and other poets, and eventually began to write my own poems. Rawlings, who recently made his first trip to Vietnam since he was there as a soldier, has been haunted throughout his life by the war. The images from the war do not go away. The bodies, the carnage, faces, the children, the smells, the concussions, all are present. These images make their way into his poems. Rawlings, who was one of several co-founders of Veterans for Peace, which today claims thousands of members and 130 chapters worldwide, has spent his life trying to convey the horror of war and atone for the crimes we committed against the Vietnamese people. Joining me to discuss the war, its aftermath, and his return to Vietnam after 53 years is Doug Rawlings, who is a retired professor of English from the University of Maine, Farmington. Let's just run through the experience you had in Vietnam, because it's something you've been grappling with for a lifetime.
Well, I was part of that package, if you will. It happened at, the end of 68 and beginning of 69 when things were going horribly for the United States military. So I was literally drafted out of graduate school, 8 weeks basic training, 8 weeks AIT down at Fort Sill and artillery, a 2-week leave, and then bam, Vietnam. And back in those days, of course, we didn't go with a unit. So when I landed in Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in July of 69, I didn't know anybody. I was totally alone. Of course, they do the usual military shuffle back and forth and get on a chopper, do this, that, everything else. And I ended up at this landing zone in the Central Highlands with the 173rd Airborne. And then after about 5 months there, we moved further north and built a fire base to support the 173rd. So I was in a place where our great fear was the NLF, the so-called Viet Cong. We were at the fire base. We had 4 howitzers to support the 173rd, and we were mortared, and sappers came at us and various things like that throughout the 13 and a half months I spent there, 411 days, or 822 nights, if you will, because it was the nights that we were terrified. We were really very worried.
Talk about the experiences there that most affected you.
Well, beyond the obvious thing of living with the knowledge that someone was trying to kill you the whole time you were there, right? I mean, that wires you in a certain way. But what we did, myself and 3 other guys, after about 9 months in country, we decided to go into the village of Bang San. And so everything was off limits, of course. We're in this little fire base with like concertina wire and all that stuff. And we went to the village and we took off our helmets and flak jackets and stacked our weapons and let somebody watch them. And we walked into the village and engaged with the people. And they were just stunned by that, seeing 4 soldiers without weapons and all that kind of stuff. And that really moved me. Obviously, it was the only people who were there were women and old men and couple and little kids, people our age, they were not to be found at all. So that was that. I think that was the overwhelming experience for me, that um, engaging with these people as human beings, as opposed to dehumanized objects of war, probably was the most moving experience for me.
I know you've written about the faces of the children, the way they looked at you.
Yeah. Um, I've got some pictures of them. My friend took some pictures and I took some pictures, but there are a few. For example, there was this Vietnamese girl. She might have been 10, 11 years old. Um, she was, we called her Little Butterfly, and she sold us dope, and also prostitutes. Okay. And so I didn't have kids at the time when I was there. When I came back and started raising a family, I realized what we had done to that poor girl, how we had just destroyed her childhood because she was doing that kind of stuff just to survive. And that really got me. That really stays with me. It's what we did to the children more than anything else that bothers me the most, quite frankly.
I think anybody who's been to war, myself included, what's most devastating is what's done to the children.
Yeah, and that's what struck me when I went back this time for this conference that I went to. I went back with my son, and the opening moment of the conference, these young Vietnamese girls and boys, I don't know, 15, 16-year-old, got up on the stage and started singing, and with just beautiful animation, beautiful, and I just lost it because I hadn't seen that kind of those children, Vietnamese children, ever. And all of a sudden, there they were, right there, and engaged with life and just really having a wonderful experience. And I was just blown away by that.
Artillery you kill from a distance. It's different from being in a firefight. It is a difference. It's more abstract. Talk about that difference.
Well, the guys would 173rd guys would go out and leave the wire and go out and engage. And if they needed our help, they'd call in artillery. Then they'd come back in, right? And it was difficult dealing with them and talking to them. The range of the howitzers we had 8 inchers and 175s, which were large weapons. So you're right. I didn't see any of that firsthand. I got
We
that
should be
encounter.
clear, Doug. A 175. Describe it. It's a very large weapon.
It's a very large howitzer, right? It's got a round range probably of about 20 kilometers, I would think. And the 8 inchers were even larger. And they had a range of about 10, 15 kilometers probably.
And you're talking about massive shells, very large shells.
Huge. Yeah. And the thing one of the things that really got me, I could understand when the coordinates were called in to assist the infantry and stuff like that. But more often, more times than I care to admit, they did what they called H&I, which is harassment and interdiction. They would just sporadically fire off these rounds just to keep them on their toes, quote unquote, right? And if you just stop for a second and think, they're not even aiming at a military target, if you will. These things are coming in, God knows where. So, yeah.
How quickly did you realize the war was an atrocity?
Well, probably. I like to refer to myself as a spoiled white male coming out of a college experience and stuff like that. I had no idea what the military was involved in and stuff. And so I was amoral, if you will, not even really aware of, other than the fact that I'm from Rochester, New York, and I used to go back home from Cleveland where I went to school, and I'd bump into guys I went to high school with who were coming back from Nam, and they were really messed up, and but that didn't register with me at all. So I kept a journal while I was over there, and I was writing actually on the plane flying from the United States to Vietnam, my concerns, my worries, if you will. And I literally, it's honest to God truth, because I've got this written in my journal, so it's got to be true, right? I was reading John Paul Sartre's book on genocide on the plane over to Vietnam. So I knew intellectually, I knew this is wrong. But when I was actually there, it really got me viscerally. It really, really struck home. And I quickly got out of that notion they like to give you in the military that you're going to become a man, that kind of stuff, like you're playing in your own little sandbox and not affecting anybody. Well, I saw the impact we were having on the villagers. I saw young American men who were probably decent human beings turned into sociopaths, if you will, and some perhaps even psychopaths. Um, and I just saw this thing, unraveling in front of me, and so I got angrier and angrier and angrier. Um, and I was they tried to give me an Article 15 in the military, which is a reduction in rank, for doing this horrible thing, which was engaging with the Vietnamese people.
This is when you went into the village.
No, actually, we're at this fire base, and these majors would show up to make rank, right, to get in the combat zones and stuff. And these young punks, if you will, a lot of them were. I have friends who are officers now, but back then it was like, forget it. And this one guy showed up, and I've been in country, I don't know, 7 months or whatever, and he all of a sudden decided that we were not going to talk to the villagers who came to the wire, like I mentioned, the young girls selling us drugs and prostitutes and stuff like that. But villagers would come to the wire and just start trying to engage with us and stuff. And so this guy said, "No way, you guys are buying dope. Oh, forget it." And I just looked at him and I said, "Screw you." And I walked to the wire and started talking to him. And of course, he wrote me up an Article 15, which was a reduction in rank, and who knows what else. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. I'm not bragging or anything, but I'm a college student, right? I kind of figured out things. I knew how to write. So I wrote up my defense and I flew into Phuket Air Force Base, which was, I don't know, 50 kilometers from where we were. And they had an adjutant general's office there. And I presented my case. My case basically was, you guys gave us a card that says your job is to win hearts and minds. How can we win hearts and minds if we're not allowed to communicate with the Vietnamese? Which was my argument. And I won, sort of. I won and I beat that Article 15. I ended up burning a lot of shit when this guy really hated me after that. I mean, he fought everything he could do to make my life miserable after that. But anyways, it was that kind of resistance, right? And there was moments when people, we would defy orders, which you're not supposed to do in the military, right? We'd have these guys tell us, "Okay, we want you to drive to wherever, take your deuce and a half and go to wherever." And we do some quick calculation and said, "Sir, if we do that, we're going to be coming back at night, and there's no way in hell we're going to drive down those roads at night." And then they would find some way to sound like they were still in authority, but they'd listen to us because we were not going to do it. So,
What did you learn about the military? What did you learn about war? And what did you learn about yourself?
how much time you got? I learned about the military. To me, I like to think, okay, I was an economics major and I was working on my MBA, and my dad was an executive at Eastman Kodak, and I was heading into the corporate world until I was drafted. And the military showed me exactly how a bureaucracy really, really works, right? Which is authority figures dictating your lives, treating you like assets, literally, as they called us. And I said, "There's no way in hell I'm going to go back into a bureaucracy like that." So the military taught me that. I learned about war was, as I made reference to earlier, it's more than just a personal journey, right? There's the impact on other people is immense, and it's almost, as you well know from your experiences, it's almost impossible to capture it totally in words and even in images because there's so many other factors, the smells and the sounds and stuff like that, and it's an overwhelming experience. I kind of thought of myself, I was going to be like a Norman Mailer or an Ernest Hemingway, right? I was going to write about this experience from an objective stance, from a distance, if you will. No, it engages you entirely, 100%. And I did stuff that I would probably, I just didn't think I would do. And so war impacted me like that. And I came back incredibly angry. I spent an extra 34 days there, which were the longest days of my life, quite frankly, because I discovered that if I came back stateside with less than 6 months of active duty, I could get out of the military. So I literally spent the shortest possible time you could in the military. I came back one day less than 6 months. So I knew that I could not in any way function stateside in a military base. I was so angry. I was so disgusted with this uniform and stuff. So, I learned that, I guess, about myself. And then I dabbled with joining with the VVAW in Boston. I moved up to Boston really quickly, but sort of Then I joined the Socialist Workers' Party because they were really militant and they were organized and they had some good stuff going on. Because I was trying to give my voice somehow to the peace movement, and this was early on. Uh, so that's sort of changed everything I looked at from then on. I decided to become a high school English teacher because I wanted to work with young people and not preach to them, but in a sense direct them in another way from the way the recruiters were trying to convince them to go. So my life was totally changed, obviously.
Let's have you read one of your poems. Let's begin with Unexploded Ordnance, the ballad.
Okay, Unexploded Ordnance, the ballad. I wrote this for Chuck Searcy, who's a founder member of, and I met with him when I was in Vietnam, of Project Renew, which is dedicated to removing unexploded ordnance from the villages. There are kids, this 50 years later, there's still kids having their legs blown off and arms blown off by these cluster munitions, if you will, that were dropped off. So as an artillery person, I felt a sort of real personal um, um, guilt, if you will, to unexploded ordnance. So here's the ballad. So I was maybe all of 21 when they whipped me into some kind of soulless shape. Yet another one of America's weeping mother's sons, set forth into this world to raise, pillage, and rape. And now it's coming on to another Christmas Eve, and songs of joy and peace fill up our little town. How, I asked myself, could I possibly believe I could do what I did and not reap what I had sown? In that land far away from what I call home, a grandfather leads his granddaughter by the hand into a field where we did what had to be done. They trip into a searing heat, brighter than 1,000 suns.
Use the word rape. Women are always collateral in war. Prostitution, war creates prostituted women, perhaps only in greater numbers or corpses created. Let's talk about that aspect of war because it's not often talked about. There were brothels set up, prostitution was rife.
Yeah, and one of my first experiences when I was there, I didn't know what was going on. I was one of these greenies, and these guys loaded into a deuce and a half, had me drive the truck, and they said, "Stop here and wait for us." And it's this little village, and they went in, and they were engaging with what they called prostitutes. And I saw some, I just sitting there looking, and I saw some of these girls come out of the thing, and they were like 16. I don't know. They were young teenage girls, right? And these guys called them whores, right? And I just, what the hell? And I realized that was actually going on. But when I use the word rape in that poem, I go beyond just women. I'm talking about raping the environment. I'm talking about raping our minds, raping us, if you will. It's oftentimes it's I have to be very careful in making this illusion, but I still kind of make it on occasion. And so, in a sense, when those of us who were drafted were in a sense raped. The government didn't care about us at all. They wanted our bodies, they wanted to use us, and then they wanted to discard us when we were done, when they were done with us, right? So I'm sort of trying to capture that notion as well. But the whole idea of prostitution was prevalent throughout that war, and you're right. And there were brothels, all this. I was never in a city the whole time I was there. I was pretty much in this little village and outside this village the whole time I was there, except when I went on R&R to Australia. But it was there. It was just women were just as it's the old cliche. They were just part of the war.
Yeah.
When we took advantage of that.
Let's read the girl in the picture.
The girl in the picture comes from the famous picture of Fanti Kim Phuc. Most of us in our generation know that picture, right? When you say the girl, when I say the girl in the picture, to people from my generation, they know immediately the picture I'm talking about.
Yeah, that was first published in Ramparts by Bob Scheer.
And it became, for me, and for many of us, it became an iconic picture of the realities of that war. So I wrote this picture. I wrote this poem, the girl in the picture. But I like to tell people I began writing this poem as a poem of about suicide. And I like to tell my kids and my loved ones, not all poetry is autobiographical, right? Doesn't mean the old man's going to commit suicide tomorrow. But I was grappling with this notion of suicide, and what we used to call in the Vietnam War single car suicide. A lot of guys you'd find guys dead alongside of the road, no alcohol involved at all, just smash their cars into a tree going 70 miles an hour, right? And they're non-vets, and we say that's suicide. VA didn't say so. So, anyways, I'm writing this poem, and I just happened to pick up a magazine dealing with that picture. And in that magazine article, they said that Kim was 9 years old when that picture was taken. Well, when I was writing this poem, my oldest granddaughter was 9 years old, and that changed the whole poem. So here it is, called The Girl in the Picture. And I begin it with an aphorism, a Buddhist aphorism: whatever you run from becomes your shadow. The girl in the picture, whatever you run from becomes your shadow. If you're a non-vet, a survivor of sorts, she'll come for you across the decades, casting a shadow in the dying light of your dreams. Naked and 9, terror in her eyes. Of course, you'll have to ignore her if you wish to survive over the years, but then your daughters will turn 9, and then your granddaughter's 9 as the shadows lengthen. So you'll have no choice on that one night, screaming down the ridge road, lights off, under a full moon. She's standing in the middle of the road, still naked and 9, terror in her eyes. Now you must stop to pick her up, to carry her back home to where she came from, to that gentle village where the forgiving and the forgiven gather at high noon. There are no shadows.
That's beautiful. So let's
So I
talk about.
consider, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I consider it a poem of remorse. And I say I have no right. And when I went back to Vietnam, I felt this 100%. I have no right to ask the Vietnamese people to forgive me for what I did, for being a participant in that war. If they do forgive us, it's wonderful. We accept it graciously and wonderfully, but I have no right to ask for that. So in a sense, what I was writing about was that whole notion of somehow can I put my life together and engage with the Vietnamese people in some way that they could offer me some forgiveness. So that's at the heart of that poem, I think.
Let's talk just briefly about your readjustment following the war, and then your return. You went back with your son. 53 years. You're back in Vietnam.
I'm a huge fan of Carl Jung's notion of synchronicity, of things happening. There's no such thing as a coincidence. Things happen in a certain way. So when I was in Vietnam, I started corresponding with this woman who I dated in college. And as it went along, I finally said, "Hey, you want to meet me when I get out of the Army?" And she said, "Sure." So she met me in San Francisco when I processed out. And what we did then, we went down to Los Angeles. And then this is 1970, of course, 71. Yeah. 71. We hitchhiked across the United States. A cop actually took us to the thing, and people from our generation don't realize this, but when you hitchhiked, you got on this ramp, and there were like 10 people lined up hitchhiking rides, and there we were. And for 3 weeks, I was on the road before I even went home. With Judy. And by the way, Judy and I have been married 52 years now. Okay. But she was there, right? And I was able to sort of start processing out this whole thing. I like to tell people didn't tell anybody. I wasn't wearing a uniform or anything, but I'd get into a car and the driver would look at me, and after about 10 nanoseconds say, "You a non-vet?" God damn, how'd you know that? Well, guess what? So, but it was 3 weeks of that, processing that out. And then we moved up to Boston. We didn't know anybody. I got a job in a hospital. I've got a degree now. I got an economics degree. I could have gotten a job. I could have gone to Eastman Kodak. But I got this thing, and I started just counting pills and filling bottles in this Coast Guard hospital for a year, getting involved in the anti-war movement as much as possible. And we moved out to Seattle and got involved there, and came back to Boston and got my degree and stuff. So I was processing that whole war, in a sense, trying to distance myself from it, but at the same time, trying to use the experience in a positive way. So then my life unfolds and whatnot. And in 1984, I'm up here now in Farmington, Maine, and we had this wonderful group. We still have Western Maine Peace Action Workshop, and we bring people in. And we brought this couple to speak to us about the Nicaragua War. This is 1984. Jerry and Judy Genesio, they were part of the Witness for Peace program. They'd gone to Nicaragua as citizens, American citizens, trying to intervene as much as possible. So they spoke to us about their experience. And at the end of it, Jerry, whose brother was killed in Vietnam, and Jerry, who's a Marine, ex-Marine, said, "I'm looking for some veterans who might want to form a peace group. Anybody interested?" Yeah. Okay. So 5 of us here in Maine formed Veterans for Peace in 1985. And our whole mission is to abolish war. And we take this pledge of nonviolence as much as possible. And we try to make it as transparent and as open a group as possible. And as you alluded to earlier, we have 130 chapters now, 6 international chapters, NGO status, United Nations. So that's what I've been trying to do with my life, is trying to turn that experience that I've had from a negative one into a positive one as much as possible. And I also, you make reference to PTSD, which I, refer to and stuff like that. But there's a term out there now called moral injury, which I think is much more comprehensive and engages me much more. Which is basically, if you're involved in something, it's either the perpetrator or the witness of something, and you don't do something, you don't try to stop it from happening, you're going to suffer from moral injury. And oftentimes you don't realize it until years later, decades later. And that's why I think a lot of guys my age who are now vets are going through that moral injury thing. Like, oh my God, I really did do that. I really did that. As fathers of children ourselves and grandchildren, we just, it's overwhelming sometimes to realize what we did to the people. So still working with that, trying to work on that. So
Let's read this poem, Vietnam Redo, going back for Josh. And then just in the last couple minutes, talk about what it meant to go back, or maybe talk a little bit for a minute about what it was like to go back and read. We'll end with a poem.
Okay. Well, first off, I went back, so that's 53 years. And so I went back as part of a conference for this book, Waging Peace in Vietnam, Ron Carver's wonderful collection. And we were invited to speak at this conference, which is the Vietnam engaging with Vietnam. It was all Vietnamese people put together this conference. And they asked us to be participants in it, to present a panel, if you will, because of the work that Ron had been doing at the War Remnants Museum in Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City. And the director there, Dr. Juan, asked us to present at this conference. And so we did. And there were about 500 people at the conference, almost all of them Vietnamese, scholars and some college students and whatnot. So that's why I went back. I didn't want to go back as a tourist, although I did the tour kind of stuff. I wanted to present something, okay? So we did. We presented this panel. It was very well received. One wonderful experience I had was a guy who was a former Viet Cong, attended it, and we ended up hugging because he thanked us for telling the people about the fact that there really was a GI resistance movement. They're really members of the military, American military, who are trying to stop that war, to help them, to save their lives. And a lot of the young people, of course, were totally unaware of that. So our conference did that. So I did that, and I was smart enough. Someone said to me, look at it, you're tender age, I'm 76, right? They said, you ought to bring somebody younger with you. And so I have a son and a daughter, and I offered them, and my daughter couldn't go, but my son could. He's 46 years old, right? And my wife can attest to this. I spent a lot of my life not talking about the war with my kids. I just didn't want to put that on them. But when Josh came with me, it's a long flight, and then we get there, and I met guys who've been living there for years. Chuck Sish had been living there 35 years, and there's another guy, David, 12 years. So Josh had to listen to us old war veterans swap war stories and stuff like that. And so he got a glimpse of the war from that perspective. But he also got a glimpse from the Vietnamese perspective. And we traveled around. After the conference, we left the conference, and Chuck, who was the director of Project Renew, we flew to Dong Ha. We got a car. He was a driver. We drove to the DMZ. We drove to Da Nang. We drove to Khe Sanh. We drove to Dong Ha. And we're out on the roads, and really engaging with the countryside. And my son was just really taken by it. He's an international traveler. And he said one thing, which I love, and then I'll read this poem, I guess. But he said, he'd been to he was in Mexico a lot. And he said, when you're in Mexico, it's sort of like you're always on edge because the people there are just trying to, sell you something. He wandered around Hue, where the conference was, in Hanoi and stuff like that. And he said, I felt so peaceful, so safe the whole time I was there. I mean, Hanoi's got 10 million people in it, for God's sakes, right? It's a sprawling city. And he said, the Vietnamese people were just so amazing. Anyways, so here's a poem called Vietnam Redux. I wrote it for my son, Josh. I look twice now where I used to look only once, like where routes 2 and 4 merge with Route 156, or when my imagination takes me to a little village just on the other side, of the river Styx, where there truly was hell to pay those many years ago, across that river and up and down those swirling tides, where Beelzebub got to play with his gift box of G.I. Joes as we desperately hung on for his satanic little ride. I went back to that land of my 50-year-old dreams, thinking I'd finally put some nightmares out to pasture, hoping to quiet down those Mama San beetle mouth screams, looking for that proverbial sense of closure. But who am I to expect more from this madly tortured land that once swallowed up my illusions of masculine grandeur and spat out a soldier boy who had tried to become a man, only to become a tool of that mindless, endless slaughter? So I still feel that way, right? I mean, as much as I'm trying, I have feelings of remorse and I'm trying to do stuff like that. I still ultimately feel, and I cannot get away from the fact that I was, in fact, a tool of the military that did these horrible things. Uh, so,
I want to ask uh, about the difference between those veterans who come back, attempt to confront rather than bury what they did, and become active, as you have been in the peace movement, and those who essentially don't process their experience. You've seen both, and I want you to talk psychologically about the different routes that they travel.
for 3 years, I went up to our VA hospital psychiatric ward to work with patients on a weekly basis. And what I would do is I bring poetry from the Civil War, Walt Whitman, right up through the Afghan and Iraq wars, including Vietnam. And the patients that I worked with probably were, I get maybe 10 or 12 at a session, and there was a mix of Iraq and Afghan war veterans and Vietnam war veterans, right? And they were there not by choice. These had serious psychological problems, and mostly, of course, dealing with drugs and alcohol and whatnot. And it was, and I would come in, and I love telling people this. I would come in this early into the sessions, and I'd use, I probably can't use this word on your radio program, but I would use the so-called F word, if you will, almost immediately, so they would know that I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a teacher, I'm a veteran. And I just want to talk to them about the power of poetry and how it can change, or the arts, how it can help them get through their lives. And one of the things I would point out, they all kept therapeutic journals. So I would say, after we read some poems, I'd say, take something from your therapeutic journal, turn it into a poem, if you will. And they would, and then I would say, okay, and then we put them on a table, and I say, see, we're talking about this thing here, this artifact called your poem. We're not talking about you. We're not talking about your experience. We're talking about this poem. And the nurses said that was incredibly therapeutic because they were able to distance themselves from it, but at the same time engage with it, right? And that's the hard part of it all, right? I will never forget what I did and what happened to me in that war. But at the same time, I don't want it to dominate my life, right? And so I really do believe that we can actually set it aside, if you will, those experiences to some extent, and use them instead of them using us, right? We can selectively say, okay, I'm going to talk about Nam right now. Okay, I'm going to talk to you guys about it right now. And then I'm going to walk out this door, and I'm not going to talk about it again, right? But it's still there, right? And so I honestly think the difference is, for veterans to be able to transform their experiences into some kind of art form. And I'm not talking about proselytizing. I'm not talking about preaching. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm just talking about trying to transform it into something that can express the sort of the visceral experiences that they've had. Because I think we over intellectualize this whole process, and people want to talk in the abstract about war. Doesn't work. Not for me, anyways. You know, hence we have Joe Biden going to Hanoi and talking about China and talking about commerce and all this kind of stuff, and not once talking about the plight of the Vietnamese people and the horrible things that happened and that we did. And I think that's what the arts do.
Well, Jung calls it the wounded healer,
Ah, wow. I
and
never heard that.
those who are truly able to heal are those who carry the wounds,
Wow.
which is
Right.
precisely what you've done. And it is as the wounded healer that, let's not call it, psychic wholeness, but it's psychic survival. And that I think there is a difference between those such as yourself who take the experience that you had in war and seek to fight against war, and those who attempt to shut it off. I think that it's very self-damaging not to grapple on both a psychological and a moral level with what you've been through.
Ironically, there are guys that they refer to their military service as the highlight of their life, right? For many of them, right? And for me, it was one of the lowest periods of my life, right? And yet I still want to honor and respect those guys, those people, men and women who, speak about that whole thing. We just had our VFP national conference via Zoom, and one of the workshops was these Mexican American soldiers who were promised and given United States citizenship, and then they served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when they came back, and they got caught in some kind of minor, whatever, drug possession, whatever, and they were deported. So we have a chapter in Tijuana, Mexico, VFP, working with these guys, people trying to get them back. And one of the stories that was told of this woman she was a combat medic in Iraq, Hispanic woman. She came back and was heavily dealing with drugs herself. That's the only way she deal is to get stoned and all that kind of stuff. And then she had to start dealing drugs on the street to survive, to get money for her drugs. And she was busted and deported and stuff and called a prostitute and a whore and all that kind of stuff. And she got back in the United States because of the efforts of Veterans for Peace, right? She thanked us for that, and that's the kind of work that we're doing. Her experience was stunning, amazing, combat medic, you can well imagine. And then to have that happen to her, those are the stories that we want out there more and more and more, quite frankly.
Great. That was Doug Rawlings, retired professor of English from the University of Maine, Farmington, poet and Vietnam veteran. I want to thank the Real News Network and its production team, Cameron Granadino, Adam Coley, David Hebden, and Kayla Rivera. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.